Members of the audience, thank you for being here. Viewers at home, thank you as well. So I'm a Navy medic, and T-Tri-C are the guidelines that I follow in my goal to save my teammates' lives should the situation arise. T-Tri-C employs a methodical, evidence-based approach to help reduce the number of battlefield deaths. And these are from lessons learned in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and the smaller conflicts that we've seen in between there. T-Tri-C was developed by the Department of Defense, and it's maintained and updated by the Defense Health Agency, the Joint Trauma Service, and the Committee for T-Tri-C. So today, my goal is to inform you, the audience, and anyone viewing on how T-Tri-C has impacted survivability rates on the battlefield, and also give you a little bit of history. So the history of T-Tri-C began in the mid-1990s with an experimental research study proposed by Special Operations Command in order to prepare for any potential engagements. A few years later, when we went into Afghanistan and later Iraq, the Department of Defense needed to update those guidelines in order to give pre-hospital medical providers the best tools that they could in order to save lives. So some of the things that we learned in these engagements are that there is a huge number of injuries on the battlefield that ultimately take service members' lives that we can prevent. Estimates of these numbers are as high as 28% of all battlefield fatalities could have been prevented, and that was found by the research group Holcomb et al. And that benchmark really came in 2001 at the beginning of our engagement in Afghanistan. Fast forward 10 years later, and you can see a group conducted by a research study by the 75th Ranger Regiment that out of 419 battlefield injuries, only 3% ended in preventable fatality. So that's a huge improvement over 10 years. And one of the things that was attributed to that huge boon to success was the fact that the 75th Ranger Regiment is one of the strictest practitioners and proponents of T-Tri-C education. So T-Tri-C, based on these successes, and the committee that supports it, believes that all military personnel should be well-versed in its practices. That meaning that combat medics should be absolute masters in the craft, and that people that aren't medics should at least be competent in its most basic practices. One of those practices, and really the focus of T-Tri-C, at least in its most elemental phases, is the march algorithm. So in essentially the breadth of research that was conducted from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq, it found that the majority of preventable deaths were caused by massive hemorrhage, airway obstruction, and respiration. And those, not coincidentally, are the first three letters in the acronym MARCH. So massive hemorrhage, what that means and what it means for preventable battlefield death is exsanguination from an isolated extremity injury, which just means bleeding out of an arm or a leg. And that's something that we can prevent very easily and quickly with the placement of a tourniquet. That's something that anybody in any room can do, let alone members of the military. And what Ron Bellamy, who conducted probably the largest trauma-related death study that the military has ever seen in 1984, based on a huge aggregation of Vietnam War data, found that 60% of preventable battlefield deaths were caused by massive hemorrhage. So that, the first phase in March, as purported by T-Tri-C, is the #1 step in preventing battlefield death when it is avoidable. And then the second letter in that MARCH acronym is airway obstruction. So what that means is that there is something in your airway that's preventing air from getting from outside of your body into your lungs where respiration occurs. And this is caused by either inhalation burns from blasts, from facial trauma or even allergic reactions. The way that we remedy this is by bypassing the afflicted airway with airway adjuncts like NPAs, which is a nasal pharyngeal airway, or a surgical cricothyroidotomy. And that same study by Ron Bellamy found that 6% of all battlefield deaths that were deemed to be preventable were caused by airway obstruction. And the third letter in the March algorithm, R, is respiration. So that same study by Ron Bellamy found that 33% of battlefield deaths that were deemed to be preventable were caused by a tension pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax is a respiration problem, and it's caused by an increase in intrathoracic pressure, where air is getting into this cavity, your pleural space, where the lungs sit, but not the lungs themselves, and that air can't get out. So as air gets in and can't escape, it increases that pressure, which collapses lungs and reduces the venous return of the vena cava, in turn decreasing cardiac output to life-threatening levels. It's actually a relatively easy fix for what sounds like a complicated problem. T-Tri-C recommends that we use essentially a large duct tape-like patch called the chest seal, and we place it over the entrance and exit wounds to prevent air from getting in, and then we use 14-gauge IV catheters, needles, to let that air escape. So based on the March algorithm and the basic T-Tri-C guidelines, we've seen a huge increase in survivability on the battlefield, over 20%, which means hundreds of people have gone home to families, if not thousands, because of what T-Tri-C has been preaching to military units. And for that, I'd like to thank them for what they do and hope that we can continue to proliferate T-Tri-C education to every member of the military so that we can reduce battlefield deaths to a never before seen low. Thank you. I will now be taking 2 minutes of questions from anybody that has them. I should have prepared you guys for this, I apologize.
What are the 3 goals of T-Tri-C?
So the 3 goals of T-Tri-C are to treat injured combatants. They're to reduce the risk of future casualties, of additional casualties, and to achieve mission success. Great question.
Do you know what % of the military is taught T-Tri-C?
I do not, but honestly, I do not think that a statistic exists on that. But maybe you and I can get together and we can head up the study. And another roughly minute. Anything T-Tri-C, medical related, statistics, let's talk.
Can you go into the C and the H letters of March?
Sure, I'd love to. So C, circulation, H, head injury, hypothermia. So the C, circulation, we're talking about essentially supporting vital signs like blood pressure. We need to make sure that an individual is perfusing all of their vital organs, and that's what's ultimately we're trying to do, is make sure that those organs perfuse. So C is more for medics in particular to get into the weeds and titrate those vital sign numbers to the proper levels. And then that hypothermia head injury, we've got what we call the lethal triad of coagulopathy, acidosis, and hypothermia. And the lethal triad they are 3 factors that reduce your blood's ability to form clots. And essentially it's gonna can help you continue to bleed out. And if we can support those, if we can stop hypothermia by just keeping somebody warm once they've lost a large volume of blood, we can keep them alive longer. And the other 2 we can get into another time. And then head injury, I think it's roughly 21% of battlefield deaths are caused by central nervous system injury, and identifying those injuries earlier rather than later is key to positive outcomes.
Thank you.
No problem.
You mentioned that massive hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of preventable death. Do you have anything that people who aren't trained medics should know about impromptu tourniquets, ways to control bleeding without a tourniquet?
Yeah, so the easiest way where you don't need any other adjunct but your 2 hands and your limbs is to apply direct pressure. So for massive hemorrhage, we're talking about an arterial bleed where blood is spurting out of a high pressure hose in the body. And one thing that you can do is you can find the source of the bleed, you put a finger on it and pressure, and you're going to stop that blood from spurting out. You can also apply pressure above the injury site. It's a little bit less precise and less effective. Something that you can do, impromptu tourniquets. You can take a pillowcase and a stick and turn it, anything that you can create, like a windlass type object, and put tension on it in order to like clamp off those hoses. You can try a belt. There are no bounds to the creative ways that you can pursue in order to stop bleeding. But in the situation that you ever find yourself where you need to stop a bleed, it needs to be done as quickly as possible. Every drop of blood contains, I think, 6 million red blood cells. So every drop counts. All right, that concludes the Q&A session. Thank you guys very much.
Good.